Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at the age of exploration. These are going to be the notes that we're going to be using. At the end, I'm going to do a couple of learning objective questions, but I'm going to try to go ahead and present those to you now. So you might want to jot these down while you're listening. That way you'll have them and you can answer them at the end on your on your note sheet when you finish. So, um, let's talk about what those learning objective questions are going to be. Number one, you're going to need to list the explorers and what countries they actually came from and what were some of their major accomplishments. So those are going to be the main ones that you're going to want to list on that question. The second question is going to be, what countries were mainly involved in the age of exploration, and what were some of the things that they accomplished. So that's going to be the second learning objective question. So by the time you finish watching the video and listening to the lecture notes, you should be able to answer those two questions. So it's just two questions, should be pretty easy for you to do. Just make sure that you do those at the end and you write those questions down. So with that being said, let's get into it. Of course, the age of exploration occurs during the Renaissance period. You definitely want to know that. Mainly the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries are when we're going to see a lot of this stuff taking place. One of the early European countries that's going to lead the way is going to be Portugal. Portugal is going to lead the way in exploration. They're going to go to places like West Africa. They're going to explore parts of Asia, like into India and into the Spice Islands, and they're also going to explore the coast of South America. Remember, Portugal. The reason why Portugal, that's another question there too, is because Portugal, where it's located at, it's located near the Atlantic. It's located near the Mediterranean Sea. You definitely want to know that. So it was in the middle of a lot of trade that was going on as well. And so it just made perfect sense that most of these early explorers are going to come from the country of Portugal. Their major emphasis was going to be on trade. Remember, we just said because of their location. They were looking for gold. They did establish the slave trade in West Africa because they were some of the first Europeans to sail down the coast of West Africa. And they were always looking for new products and spices. So those spices, remember, came into play after the Crusades. And of course, Portugal wants to bring back a lot of those spices so they can make a lot of money and become very wealthy. One of the early Portuguese explorers was Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator is going to establish a school. Of course, Portugal is going to back him. They're going to support the idea of exploration and trade. But Prince Henry is going to establish a school that is going to be for people who want to become sea captains or navigators or sailors. And so he establishes this school to help these guys learn how to navigate the oceans. One of his students was a guy named Bartholomew Diaz. Diaz, the main thing you need to know about him was that he did make it to the tip of Africa, and so he is the first European to get to the Indian Ocean via that way, going down the coast of Africa all the way to the tip. And of course, once they realize where they are, they realize it's not too much of a jump to get to India from the southern portion of Africa. Vasco da Gama was another Portuguese sailor. He commanded the first European ship to sail directly from Europe to India in 1498, shortly after Diaz. He sailed around the southern tip of Africa and then eventually to India. He's going to help establish lucrative trade routes between India and Europe, which is going to make Portugal very, very wealthy. The next Portuguese sailor of importance is Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan Portuguese explorer. He was the first to circumnavigate the world, meaning he was the first to sail completely around the world between 1519 to 1522. Of course, Magellan did not make it all the way on this voyage. He would actually die in the Philippines. So he did not make it. His crew started off with like 200 and something. I believe only 18 to 20 of them actually made it back. So Magellan gets credit for being the first man, or his crew being the first crew to sail completely around the world once and for all, proving that the world was round. This is just a picture of Magellan's route, and you can see he leaves from Portugal, sails down the coast of South America, across the Atlantic, down the coast of South America, around the tip of South America, across the Pacific. Of course, again, he dies in the Philippines. His crew continues on into the East Indies, then through the East Indies, across the Indian Ocean, around the southern tip of Africa, and then back home. In Spain, Spain is very envious of Portugal's success. They're making a lot of money. Portugal's becoming very wealthy. So they begin to set out a path to find wealth themselves and find a path to Asia. Because of this competition, tension is going to increase between Spain and Portugal. Christopher Columbus would go to the King and Queen of Spain to get financing for a voyage that he believes that if he sails west, he would end up in India. Of course, Columbus was an Italian explorer, and he sailed for the country of Spain. He landed in North America, in the Bahamas, on the island of San Salvador, and this was the first European contact with what they would call the New World. Columbus completed 4 voyages across the Atlantic Ocean between 1492 and 1503, and like we've said in class many times, Columbus died still thinking that he was somewhere near India. After Columbus, we see the Spanish began to go into parts of Central America and into the United States. These guys that went into these areas eventually became known as conquistadors. One of the most famous was a guy named Hernando Cortez. He was a Spanish adventurer. He would travel to Mexico and he would conquer a group known as the Aztecs. But Cortez and all the other guys that would follow behind him were known as conquistadors. The word conquistador means Spanish conquerors. Cortez here pictured, Spanish conquistador, explored and conquered a large part of Mexico, conquered the Aztec people, but he also made alliances with some of the native groups. The word indigenous means native. He defeated the Aztec Empire in 1519. He would later make himself the governor of Mexico. Another famous Spanish conquistador was Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro would conquer the Incan Empire in 1533. The Incan Empire was in South America. He would found the capital city of Lima, Peru, and he brought back immense wealth, gold, precious metals back to Spain after he conquered the Incas. Now, because of the tension between Spain and Portugal, they decided on a treaty known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. It would divide up the claims for Spain and for Portugal. And you notice the map, anything to the west of the line would be Spain's, anything to the east of the line would be Portugal's. This line was known as the line of demarcation. The Dutch and the English were also involved in exploration. The Dutch owned one of the largest fleet in the world with 20,000 vessels or 20,000 ships. They would found something called the Dutch East India Company, which would help make them very strong in trade, especially in India and the East Indies. The English, not to be outdone, under Elizabeth I, would establish the English East India Company in an attempt to drive the Dutch out of the East Indies and in India. And they would be successful because the British would eventually take over India and turn it into one of their major colonies. One of their famous explorers was Sir Francis Drake. He was an English sea captain and privateer, meaning that he sailed under contract whenever, and some people consider him to be a pirate. He would help defeat the mighty Spanish Armada in 1588. Of course, Spain had the most powerful navy in the entire world during this period, and Sir Francis Drake would play a large part in helping England defeat the Spanish Armada. He was the first English explorer to sail around the world. He sailed from 1577 to 1580. The French also were involved in exploration during this period. And of course, they started off mainly being in the fur trade, but the French wanted to find river passages across North America. They were also looking for a trade route to Asia to get to these spices and silk and porcelain and all these other things that we've been talking about. And they wanted to establish Christian missions to convert native people. And this is just showing you some of the area that the French were involved in, mainly in central portions of the United States and mostly parts of Canada. One of their famous explorers was a guy named Jacques Cartier, or Cartier, sometimes that's the way it's pronounced. He was also, again, French explorer. He was looking for a western passage to Asia for the French. He would claim most of the modern-day land of Canada for France in 1534. He was the first European to sail and map the St. Lawrence River, which is up near Canada. Another French explorer was Samuel de Champlain. Champlain, again, founded what would become New France and Quebec City, which is also in Canada, in 1608. He was the first European to explore and describe the Great Lakes. So as these Europeans began to come to America, they began to colonize most of the Americas. They're going to change things forever, especially for the Native Americans that were living there. Slave trade is going to be brought in to support some of these plantations that would crop up in the New World. So from 1492 to 1800, this was mainly what was going on in the Americas. Next one is Zhang He. Zhang He was a Chinese explorer. Of course, we've talked about a lot of Europeans, but we do have a real famous Asian explorer during this period. He was commander of a huge fleet of treasure ships. He would lead voyages out of China into Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Africa from 1405 to 1433. He tried to display and show the power and wealth of the Ming Dynasty during that period in China. Here's a map of some of his voyages. You can see how he traveled all around, basically from China all the way around all of South Asia, across, and then into Africa. So he would make most of these voyages again from 1405 to 1433. Look at the exit ticket and see if you can match these explorers with their routes. Based on what we've said and what we just went over, you should be able to do that. Don't forget to answer your 2 learning objective questions, basically to tell me the explorers and some of their accomplishments would be objective question number 1. Objective question number 2 would be to list the countries, the explorers that go with those countries, and explain what they were known for. So those will be the two main learning objective questions that you should be able to answer after watching the lecture video. That's going to be it, and I will catch you guys on the next one.